Good morning, Energy Media readers. Today we're going to be talking about ESG, environment, social, and governance, which is a big movement in the corporate world, has a lot to do with big influence on access to capital for companies like oil and gas and pipeline companies. So I'd like to welcome Professor Yrjö Koskinen from the Haskayne School of Business in Calgary. So welcome to the interview, Professor Koskinen.
Well, thank you, my pleasure.
Now, let me frame the question for you. And I guess maybe we should start, what is ESG?
So ESG, of course, like you said, is environmental, social, and governance. And so when you take the ESG factors into account in your investment process as an investor, then we're talking about ESG or sustainable finance practices. And they could be of several kinds. So the easiest or kind of the laziest kind is negative screening. You don't invest companies that have low ESG scores. Positive screening is that you invest in companies that are kind of best in class, that have highest ESG scores in their industry or in the geographic area.
Now, my understanding is that ESG has become a big yardstick for investors when they're measuring which companies that they want to invest in.
That's correct. So I think 2019 was the first year that ESG investing really became mainstream. I mean, it's been on the map for several years, but it's I think the big problem earlier has been so-called greenwashing. People have been talking the talk, but not walking the walk. But now investors seem to be getting really serious about it and changing their investment process according to ESG principles.
And at top of the mind around ESG in a hydrocarbon economy, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions. And so I imagine that anybody who's looking at that kind of an investment and when it considers ESG, that climate policy, managing climate risk has got to be an important part of ESG.
So managing climate policies is probably right now the most important ESG concern. I mean, ESG is much more broader concept. For example, social issues. In Canada, how do we deal with the indigenous peoples, for example, would be one ESG concern. Or our work practices would be an ESG concern. But right, the most pressing issue is clearly the climate risks.
So, how will that impact the Alberta-based oil and gas and pipeline sector? I mean, we've seen now BlackRock Inc., the world's biggest asset manager, come out and identify climate risk as a significant issue. Will it affect different sizes of companies differently?
It's so of course it's going to have a potentially huge impact on Alberta energy sector, and it might affect companies very, very differently, because we know that some Alberta companies are the leading edge of ESG or even dealing with climate risks, and some other companies are not. And the biggest risk is that financing will dry up. For certain companies, there won't be any financing available, and of course, obviously, then you can't do any investments.
And are we seeing any of that now? I mean, as I understand it, the seniors, as they're called, the big oil sands producers and so on, they do actively manage climate risk and ESG. That's a big issue for them. They have access to all the capital that they require. But at the other end of the scale, the juniors, the companies that make less than 10,000 barrels a day, are actually in a capital crisis, and they are the ones who are least able to manage ESG and climate risk and so on. What's your take on that?
So I think you're absolutely correct that so far the majors, they have the infrastructure and the personnel and the technology to deal with ESG risks, and the smaller players are struggling. They of course could be kind of intermixed with profitability. So it doesn't necessarily, if you don't get financing, it doesn't mean that your ESG risks are huge. It could be that you don't have profitable projects and nobody wants to invest because of that. But even for majors, there are some issues that are looming in the horizon. For example, all European reinsurance companies now refuse to insure oil and assets. So if you have to, let's say, start insuring your own assets, there are only few companies that can do that. You have to have a very strong balance sheet to kind of taking care of your own risk and not using the insurance markets.
We've seen in the past, Premier Kenny in particular has accused companies of like HSBC, the British Bank, and Zurich Insurance of targeting Alberta, targeting the oil sands. But really, as I've argued in a couple of columns over the last few years, this is part of a larger global trend, isn't it?
It is much larger. It's not just a couple of companies, not HSBC or Zurich. It's for right now, it's all European banks, all European reinsurance companies. Now it's spreading to the United States. You mentioned BlackRock, Goldman Sachs will be another good example. So this is a major concern for all financial institutions. And it's also major concerns for Canadian banks. So far, they have been willing to invest in Alberta oil and gas, but that might change at some point.
Professor Koskinen, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much. And because this is such a big issue and because it's becoming more critical to Alberta all the time, I look forward to chatting with you about this in the future.
I would look forward to chatting you again. Thank you so much.